Our next presenter is Shilaan, and she is a PhD student in organizational behavior at Stanford. She's interested in meta-science and inferential statistics, with a particular interest in the coordination and effectiveness of large-scale science collaborations. And she's going to talk about lay perceptions of scientific findings. So to what extent are folks swayed by the crowd? So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Rohan. I'm really excited to be here. I was here last year and really enjoyed this conference. So really fun to be here again. And thank you so much for organizing it again this year, Rohan. I'll start sharing my screen. All right, can I get a thumbs up if that looks good?
Yeah, let's.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So as Rohan mentioned, I'm really interested in meta science and large-scale science collaborations. And one thing that's been happening across many of the sciences, of course, is that we have many scientific reforms. One thing that's less clear is how effective are these reforms? Are they reaching the goals that we want them to reach? Are they actually, performing in the way that we would like them to? And one specific thing I'm interested in is crowd science. So let's say we have a crowd of researchers who all generate an estimate on something, and we have people perceiving those estimates. Are they actually more likely to be convinced by those estimates if they're generated by a crowd versus when it's just your average normal science collaboration as we're used to? So that's what I'll be talking about today. I'll present some findings on crowdsourcing data analysis that I've been working on in collaboration with my co-author, Professor Benoit Monin. This work is still pretty early stage in the sense that we ran one study. It was an invited commentary on a many analyst project, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is later on. But our plan is to submit a registered report and use this as a preliminary study. So what I would be really interested in today is your thoughts on what's interesting about this, future directions, and I hope we can spend some time afterwards in the discussion talking about how to take this further. So the outline for today, I will first share a brief open science statement and links to all the available materials. Then I will define crowd science and crowdsourced data analysis and introduce our question of interest, which is, does crowdsourcing data analysis improve lay perceptions of scientific findings? And afterwards, we'll briefly talk about the methods and results of an experiment. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for discussion regarding this experiment and future directions. All right, so first the open science statement. Of course, all the available materials are online, including a pre-registration, the survey, the data, the code, and a fully reproducible manuscript. And you can find all these on the OSF and on GitHub on the links on the slide. You can also, if you would like, browse the slides themselves at bit.ly/many-analysts. So what is crowdsourcing science? Crowd science is defined as the organization of scientific research in open and collaborative projects. And these projects can range from highly inclusive, such as when we source citizens, to more selective, such as when we source specialists like academics themselves. And crowdsourcing is used at different stages of the research process. You may have already heard of crowdfunding, which uses the crowd for funding, but you can also use a crowd of individuals for generating research ideas, for designing studies, collecting data, and analyzing data, which is what I'll be talking about today. And the birth of the citizen science movement is kind of shown in this cute little painting, which was in 1833, when a scientist named Denison Olmsted used letter correspondence to recruit citizen scientists to help document a meteor shower. And this led to a detailed documentation of the Great Meteor Shower and the birth of the citizen science movement. So according to the criteria that I just mentioned, this was of course highly inclusive and used for data analysis. So let's move on to crowdsourcing data analysis. Crowdsourcing data analysis involves giving different teams of scientists the same data set who independently analyze it to answer the same research question or estimate and report on a parameter of interest. It is also known as the many analyst or the multi-analyst approach, and it has been on the rise in the social and behavioral sciences. So I'm including here an interactive table with 7 papers that have recently been published in the social and behavioral sciences that use the many analyst approach. And they include interesting topics such as variability in replications, opinions about different social policies, the effects of gender and professional status of scientists on their verbosity during group meetings. And we can scroll all the way back to 2018 to a quite well-known study that looked at discrimination against darker skin tone soccer players and arguably started the recent crowd science movement in behavioral science. So what is the rationale of crowdsourced data analysis? Why should we be convinced by its findings? The phenomenon that underlies crowd science in general is known as the wisdom of the crowd. It's the idea that individual judgments are associated with idiosyncratic noise, but when we average over many judgments, then we can cancel some of that noise and some of that error. And perhaps the first documented case of the wisdom of the crowd was back in 1906, when 787 people guessed the weight of an ox at a farmer's fair. And the mean of all guesses was exactly equal to the true value of 1,197 pounds. This mean outperformed the estimates of cattle experts, and it also outperformed the individual best guesser who took home the grand prize that day. So now I'll mention some benefits, some of which will overlap, and most of them are intimately related to each other. So crowdsourced data analysis first can help us to diversify contributions to research. I will say that this benefit is not specific to crowdsourcing data analysis, but a property of crowd science and big team science in general. So one goal of crowd science and big team science is to promote inclusivity and to include researchers from underrepresented institutions. And this, of course, comes with all the benefits of diversity. It allows us to leverage under-resourced resources and skills. We, of course, can't all be an expert on everything, but if we recruit a diverse sample of data analysts, some may have expertise, for example, on a certain statistical method that is most appropriate for the data at hand, or they'll have some other expertise that may benefit the data analysis. Now, second, the many analyst approach can help us to acknowledge that results in social science tend to be very variable, and they can depend on idiosyncratic choices that we all have to make among multiple valid approaches, sometimes even choices we make unconsciously, such as the version of statistical software we rely on, or the different defaults in, for instance, SPSS and R. And it is important to note that the many analyst approach does not create this variability in results. It simply exposes it. And that should give us pause and epistemic humility when we assess conventional scientific research, which is often done by a single analyst or a single team. The particular outcome you're looking at is one from a distribution of outcomes that could have been possible if the analyst had made different choices. The third benefit I'd like to talk about is that it can help us assess the impact of individual analytic choices on the results. So here we can ask if, for instance, we can explain the strength of the evidence obtained by the specific, if we can explain the strength of the evidence by the specific individual decisions that researchers make, For instance, we can assess the impact of including or excluding certain control variables, the impact of running a certain statistical model, such as a t-test versus a mixed effects model, or the impact of including or excluding certain participants or outliers. In other words, we could ask, have people who obtained stronger evidence, were they more likely to do one or the other? Oh, sorry about that. Let me just scroll back a little bit. Got a little too excited there. Now, another benefit that follows from this, of course, is that the many analyst approach can help us assess the overall analytic robustness of a finding. We can assess to what extent a finding holds across many different analytic specifications. And we can ask, do the results come out consistently positive, consistently negative across these different independent analyses? And of course, when we do find out that these results come out consistently positive or negative, then this can increase our confidence in the specific conclusion that we're drawing. And going back to the wisdom of the crowd phenomenon that we discussed, another benefit is that we can average across all these idiosyncratic analytic choices to obtain more accurate parameter estimates and to balance out individual biases and errors in the aggregate. All right, so I'd like to move on to talking about lay perceptions. One of the reasons that crowdsourced data analysis was proposed was to increase the credibility of scientific research. Now, we know that there's quite a great deal of science skepticisms in some public circles. So we want scientific research to become credible, not just to ourselves as academics, but to lay people as well. And according to its proponents, that's exactly what crowd science should do. It should improve lay perceptions of scientific findings. So here I'm including another table with 3 quotes. And the first one is from a preregistration in which the authors justify their use of the many analyst approach by referring to the public needing to have faith in the conclusions of scientists. And the second one is from a commentary on the many analyst approach, in which the author provides the hopeful view that crowdsourcing data analysis will provide a new way to increase credibility, not just among researchers themselves, but also among sample populations, and that it's hoped that the many analyst approach will increase public, private, and government views of social science. The third one is from a preprint relying on the many analyst approach, in which the authors argue that many analyst studies that generate consistent results across independent analyses should offer consumers of scientific findings assurance that these are not arbitrary flukes. Now, these quotes, of course, describe a worthy goal, improving the credibility of scientific findings through crowdsourcing data analysis. However, this is also an empirical claim. And as far as we know, there's no evidence yet that crowdsourcing data analysis can indeed achieve this goal. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Does crowdsourcing data analysis improve lay perceptions of scientific findings? So I'll move on to the method of the experiment that we ran. We ran an experiment with 3 scenarios. The first condition is a conventional single analyst condition, where a single team of 6 scientists analyze the same data set and report a single aggregate parameter estimate of 5% for the relationship between 2 variables that I'll introduce shortly. And we contrast this condition with 2 multi-analyst conditions. In the multi-consistent condition, 6 independent teams of scientists report 6 independent estimates that show low variance and high consensus. So they all agree in their conclusion that in the multi-inconsistent condition, there is a large spread between the estimates and the qualitative conclusions differ. So there's a lack of consensus. 2 of the scientists find a negative relationship and 4 of the scientists find a positive relationship. Like I said, in all 3 conditions, the given estimates average to 5%. And we then study the effects of these estimates on lay participants' posterior beliefs about the reported phenomenon, the rated credibility of the results, their rated confidence in the aggregate estimate, and the extent to which they believe that this estimate was impacted by bias, scientific bias, or scientific error, or scientific discretion. A brief overview of the experimental design. So participants are first introduced to a research question, which is, do religious people report higher well-being? And they then report their prior beliefs about this research question. They're then allocated to one of the three conditions, and afterwards report the outcomes that I just described. So we based our hypotheses on three lines of thought. First, in line with social norm theory, we expected that observing consensus among a crowd, so this consistent crowd condition, would increase conformity in opinion. Second, in line with work in intuitive statistics, we also expected lay people to intuitively accord to the logic of the wisdom of crowds. So the ability of an aggregate of estimates to reduce noise stemming from individual bias or error. And then third, we also expected that there's, of course, some difficulty related to reasoning about variability. So we expect that observing these variable estimates would decrease lay confidence in the precise average parameter estimate in both crowd conditions. So this is based on the idea that it may be completely foreign to lay consumers, that analyzing the same data set can lead to different estimates in the first place. If we report one estimate, then this is taken to be the one true estimate, which might be aligned with the way that we think science should work. But if we report several variable estimates, the consumer in question may no longer be so certain that any of the given estimates or the overall average estimate is precisely correct. So these are our hypotheses. We expected that posterior beliefs would be greater in the multi-consistent condition than in the single analyst condition. So for all outcomes, we use the single analyst condition as our reference category. And we expected also ratings of credibility to be greater. Confidence, in the aggregate parameter estimate, we expect it to be lower in both conditions compared to the single analyst condition, in line with the reasoning that I just described. And you can find all these hypotheses on the OSF. So this table, just to clarify, indicates the predicted direction of the effects for all dependent variables compared to the single analyst condition, and controlling for participants' prior beliefs. All right, let's go through the survey materials. I'll do a brief time check. Okay, great. So first, participants are shown an introduction in which we explain the research question here, which is, do religious people report high well-being? We give some context on how religiosity and well-being are measured. We then immediately measure their prior beliefs. So how likely do you think it is that people who are more religious generally report higher well-being, on a slider from 0% to 100%. And then we move on to the study design, which differs across conditions. So in the single analyst condition, we tell participants about a single team of 6 researchers, and they together analyze to answer their research question, have to work together as a single team to analyze the same data set. And together they made certain choices on how to analyze the data and then report their joint findings. What's important here is that we did emphasize, even in the single analyst condition, that routiners routinely do have to make dozens of analytic choices like these, which may impact the specific results obtained. And then in the multi-analyst condition, they are also shown the study design. And in this case, we tell them about 6 independent researchers who each independently analyze the same data set to study the same research question. And they each make their own choices on how to analyze the data and then report their own independent findings. They're then shown the results for each condition. So as you can see in the single analyst condition, our comparison condition, the results are that for every 1 point increase in religiosity, survey respondents report a 5% increase in well-being. In the multi-consistent condition, We also include the exact same sentence where the independent estimates average to 5%, but they are also shown this distribution of estimates, which does show a consensus. All the estimates are positive, and a small spread between 2 to 8%. In the multi-inconsistent condition, the spread of the estimate is quite large. As you can see, it ranges from -6 to 16%. And two of the scientists conclude that there is a no relationship or a negative relationship. We then measure their posterior beliefs, the credibility of the findings, their confidence in the aggregate parameter estimates, and the extent to which they believe the findings have been impacted by researcher bias, researcher error, and researcher discretion or degrees of freedom. So let's take a look at the results. So for the results, we regress all outcomes on prior beliefs and condition with the single analyst condition as the reference category. So all results that I will show you control for prior beliefs and show the results for the two multi-analyst conditions compared to the single analyst condition. So I will now walk you through each individual aspect of this figure. In line with our hypotheses, lay consumers of multi-analyst studies with inconsistent results have lower posterior beliefs, as you can see here on the slide. They find the results less credible. They also have less confidence in the aggregate estimate of 5%, and they believe this estimate is more likely to stem from bias, from error, or from researcher degrees of freedom. Now, not in line with our hypotheses, we found that lay consumers of multi-analyst studies with consistent results, so a consistent crowd, leads to lower posterior beliefs as well, as you can see here, and to greater beliefs that the estimate stems from error. But we found no significant effects on the perceived credibility of the results, the confidence in the aggregate parameter estimate of 5%, and the perceived impact of bias on the 5% estimate. And here's a brief graph in which we show the distribution of prior and posterior beliefs across the three conditions. So it is worth noting on this figure and also a post hoc pair t-test that, as you can see, the multi-analyst studies with consistent results might perform worse than the single analyst studies, but still within the condition, there is a positive increase in belief. So this clarifies that multi-analyst studies are not necessarily bad in absolute terms when they're consistent. However, when you compare them to conventional single analyst scientific research in which only a single estimate is provided, then crowdsourcing data analysis does not seem to improve the sway and credibility of the research to lay consumers. So I'd love to move on to the discussion. We conclude that compared to a single estimate, we do not find evidence that crowd estimates improve lay perceptions of scientific findings. And in the future, we are curious to explore whether it might be aversion to variability that explains these findings and what the perceptions of scientists themselves are. So right now, we've only run a study on lay perceptions, but I'd be really intrigued to see, does more exposure to variability in scientific research in general kind of flip this phenomenon? And are we more likely to believe that crowd science improves the credibility of findings? We also believe that in the future, it is important for crowd scientists to consider how, for example, by drawing from research on science communication, to tackle science skepticism and how to effectively communicate these variable crowd estimates to lay consumers. So let's move on to the discussion. Really excited to hear people's thoughts and questions. I have not been taking a look at the chat, so I'll
thanks so much.
do that now.
That was amazing. The project is remarkable. And so thanks for telling us about it. If folks have questions or comments, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. I'll just get started though. Can you talk a little bit more about the challenges of actually like setting this up? It sounds like it would just be a nightmare to get this through ethics approval and like get funding for it. And like, what were some of the challenges that you faced there? And if other people have other questions, please just raise your hand and I'll call on you next.
And by setting this up, are you referring to the experiment itself, or
Yeah.
Yeah, the experiment? Okay, yeah. So in this case, we kind of circumvented those challenges by running a scenario study, right? It's just a vignette, and it's important to debrief participants afterwards and to tell them that, you know, these are not real findings. So it did take some time in that regard. And I do agree. It's really important to make sure this is part of why we didn't choose a very controversial topic. In the future, of course, it would be really interested. If you're talking about science skepticism, most people immediately think about climate change. Most people immediately think about, you know, resistance to vaccines, for instance. And when it comes to these topics, I think it's really important to not be contributing to misinformation by providing estimates that might go in a different direction. So I think it's a really important question. Yeah.
Do others have comments or questions for? How much guidance did you give the participants?
I showed you the whole survey, actually. So that was it. Yeah. Would you expect more guidance to be needed?
No, I'm shocked that you had such that everyone came as close as they did to each other in that case.
Yeah, I was also surprised by actually the engagement of the participants. So I had an open question at the end, and I, out of interest, you know, just asked them their thoughts. And I scrolled through all these answers at the end, and people appear to take a lot of time to think about, you know, these estimates and the relationship in general, the relationship between religiosity and well-being. So the study was quite effective in that regard. We also included attention checks to make sure that that it had gone well, and it seemed to have gone well. Yeah.
Have you given thought, Roy in the chat is asking about different audiences and specifically sort of scientific evidence to juries. Did you give a thought to other sorts of audiences?
Yeah, thank you, Roy. I think that's amazing. That's something definitely. So as I indicated in the beginning of the talk, we would like to submit a registered report. And right now, all we have is one study exploring lay perceptions. And I think the difference I had in my mind was lay versus scientists, but I completely agree that even within those groups, there are certain, you know, groups that are really interesting to explore, and juries have such important real world outcomes. I had actually not thought of juries before. Maybe I can blame my Dutch background, not having any familiarity with systems in which juries make decisions. But I think that's a great suggestion. So yeah, expert witnesses and jury interpretation of the evidence. I agree. I'm going to actually make a note of this. I think that's really interesting. And we have been given thought about to what populations we would want to include in future studies. So would love to hear people's thoughts if they have other suggestions. Definitely noting this one down. Thank you. All right.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Our 1 o'clock presenter got shifted earlier because I accidentally scheduled Monica for overlap of nap time. So we have as long as folks want. Where's the paper at? Is it at peer review stage or?
So The paper is at an interesting stage now. We first, so we were involved in a many analyst study done by a team of researchers at the University of Amsterdam. And they specifically, this is, by the way, what inspired the research question, because the many analyst study was about the relationship between religiosity and well-being. And they invited commentaries on the many analyst study. So we thought it would be interesting to explore whether multi-analyst studies actually improve credibility of the findings. So we submitted this commentary, and then we realized as we were working on it that it was actually, when we ran a whole experiment, that it was too much to just submit as a commentary. So we decided to instead hold off on that and submit a registered report. So right now I'm still in the stages of writing up the registered report and including this as a preliminary study. The goal is to submit it to advances in methods and practices of psychological science, because that's where we kind of see these multi-analyst studies being implemented. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Oh, Annie?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was super, super interesting. I was wondering, and maybe I missed something when you were showing the survey and things like that, but I was wondering if you think that there is potential for the variation between the different results, like in terms of presenting everyone with multiple different formats for coming up with the estimates, if you think that might have affected how confident people were in the results from any given individual study, as in if the variation between the like formats for coming up with the results might impact confidence for people that are looking at all of them at once more than any variation within any given study. Does that make sense?
Let me see if I understand your question. So are you saying that the format of presenting the results itself, so compared to having like one estimates, having 5 estimates next to each other rather than these specific estimates, or am I understanding that correctly?
Sorry, let me rephrase. It was my understanding that any individual participant in your study was having access to each type of results. So the single point estimate or multi-point estimates in agreement or multi-point estimates in disagreement. And then they were asked about their confidence in each of those. So do you think that showing every individual participant the 3 different types of results impacted their confidence in any given one result? And maybe that could be controlled for in future studies?
Got it. Great. Thank you for pointing this out, because actually, it was a between study experiment. So every participant only saw one of the 3 conditions. But I realize now that the way I presented them with like 3 tabs next to each other may have been less clear than I thought initially. No problem. And so these are 3 separate conditions. But your question does remind me of something that is important to separate out, which is that for a future study, there is a confound in our study. I will like readily admit that, which is that the conditions at the same time manipulate consensus and variance between the estimates. So in the in the consistent crowd condition, all the estimates are in the same direction and it's a small range. And then in the multi-inconsistent condition, not only do we have a large spread between the estimates, but we also see that some of them are negative, some of them are positive. So the consensus is also not fully there. So I definitely in the future want to kind of like separate these 2 out more clearly. Yeah. Thank you.
So Laura comments on Zooniverse. Do you know Zooniverse?
I've not heard of it, no.
Laura, did you want to expand? Or?
Sure. Zooniverse is the expansion of something that was called Galaxy Zoo, which was a great project to ask the general public to help astronomers to classify galaxies. The number of galaxies that were available, it was in 2009, I believe, that were becoming available was very hard for astronomers to catch up and classify all of them. So they asked the general public to help them, and this created a very powerful tool for classifying galaxies. And after that, that expanded into different branches, not only in astronomy, but also in social sciences and in other kind of sciences. So I invite everyone to have a look at that. It's very helpful, and it's also useful to engage students if they are interested in pursuing some kind of scientific analysis. So yeah, it's really great. And I put the link there. And thank you for your talk. It was really great.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the Zooniverse suggestion. I've definitely noted this down.
Okay, great.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Maybe if folks think about it more. So I'm kind of interested in like the Stanford setup with the Data Science Center and stuff like that. Do you want to talk just a little bit about like what you do there, what it is, and what we could steal from it here at Toronto?
Great. Yeah, of course. So I think there's two really interesting institutes at Stanford that, relate to the work that you do and to the work that everyone in this room does and what we've been talking about. So we have the Metascience Institute, which is a little older than the Stanford Data Science Institute. So let me first talk about the Metascience Institute. The Metascience Institute actually since this quarter, so about a week ago, has opened their forum to the general public. So every week, every Thursday morning, there is a speaker. So that's 9 a.m. our time, 12 at noon Toronto time. I'm not making this mistake again. And so every morning on Thursday, we have a speaker, and we also invite everyone here, of course, to be in touch. And if you have any work related to metascience to present, we are always happy to hear that. And then the Stanford Data Science Institute actually the Stanford Data Science Institute has a Center for Open and Reproducible Science called CORS. And this just launched about a year ago. Yeah, so this is about a year ago we launched, and it's a great institute that does a yearly spring event, fall event, and is working on something called an Open by Design guide. So this is something you can find actually online. It's supposed to be a very introductory guide to open science. I think the problem is, with resources for open science is there's many of them. Many also presume a background in all these skills. So they expect that you know what a Docker is, for instance, if you want to set up a reproducible environment. And so this Open by Design guide starts really from the ground up. We also have another institute at Stanford that's actually kind of all over the place right now. So I'm hoping that it'll be integrated at some point, called SPORE. And this is the Stanford Program for Research Rigor and Reproducibility, I believe. And this is more focused on the medical school. And this is led by Steve Goodman. So a lot of initiatives. There's a lot of momentum right now here for open and reproducible science. So I'm excited, and I'm very curious to see where it goes in the future, but I'm happy to keep anyone who wants to updated on events and initiatives.
Yeah, that'd be excellent. Thanks very much for the overview.
Sure.
Does anyone else have any other questions, comments for Shilaan?
One thing that I would like to add, we actually have a spring event in about, it starts in April, I believe, or end of March. And we're still looking for speakers for certain things. So if you're interested, please let me know. There's the topics are open science, introductory open science topics like introduction to reproducible environments, introduction to GitHub using Python, because I will be giving the introduction to GitHub using R talk. So happy to hear if anyone here would like to be a speaker. And I'll post the list of topics in the chat. If anything appeals to you, let me know.
Be excellent, thank you. And so maybe one final question, unless other people have, but so like you've got a law background or something, right? Like, so what was your on-ramp to all of this? So if we want to try and like encourage others into this like space, right? Sort of what you're talking about, like not hitting them with Docker and CS and all the rest of it. Like, what did you find like were the most effective on-ramps for you?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I started my PhD really not knowing much about open science, not having any background in R or anything like that. For me, it was honestly really the momentum in behavioral science, because, you know, if you take a first-year class on a graduate class on psychology or behavioral methods, it's after 2012. It sometimes can be a little depressing, you know, it can be demoralizing to realize that a lot of the work that you're trying to build on does not replicate very well. So for me, that was one driver to learn a little bit more about research reproducibility, and then started reading papers about it, and just one thing led to the other. For me, the most helpful thing has been other researchers posting their things online. Like the first time, I didn't really know what R Markdown was, but I would just download from people's repositories and knit it and see what happened, and then start working from there. So for me, the most helpful thing is always to give people templates. Like, don't expect people to start from the ground up. It's so, you know, overwhelming to have to start from the ground up. But if we provide templates and examples, I think that really helps people to implement research rigor and reproducibility practices in their own work.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your presentation. And we'll just have a quick 15-minute break through till the presenter at 1:30. Thanks very much, Shilaan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ron.